The heavy iron doors of the Moretti vault slammed shut with a finality that seemed to suck the very oxygen from the room. The sound echoing like a coffin lid hitting a stone floor in an empty, subterranean cathedral. Chong Wu leaned his massive frame against the cold, reinforced steel, his hand pressed firmly against a jagged hole in his left side that was pumping dark, rhythmic pulses of crimson onto the pristine white marble floor. He didn't wince. He didn't groan. He simply watched the liquid pool around the toes of his hand-stitched Italian leather shoes with the detached, analytical curiosity of a man watching rain hit a windshield from the safety of a dry, soundproof room. Beside him, Asha knelt in the growing Red Sea, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches that whistled through her clenched teeth. She ripped the hem of her starch-stiffened yellow maid's uniform, the fabric screaming as it tore under her desperate strength. Her hands were stained to the elbows now, slick and trembling as she pressed the makeshift bandage into the gape of the wound. Chong Wu looked down at her, his eyes like chips of ancient flint, gray, frozen, and utterly unfeeling. He reached out with his steady hand, his fingers catching a stray, sweat-soaked lock of her hair and tucking it behind her ear with a terrifying, numb composure that bordered on the supernatural. "You're wasting your time, little ghost," he whispered, his voice a dry, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the sound of her frantic movements. "I can't feel a thing. Why should you?" Asha didn't look up to acknowledge the coldness. Instead, she jammed her thumb directly into the bullet track to stem the arterial flow. Anyone else on this earth would have screamed, would have buckled in agony, would have begged for the sweet mercy of unconsciousness. Chong Wu didn't even blink. He just stared at her, his heart rate remaining a steady, haunting thrum while his life's essence drained into the grout between the tiles. "Because I can feel it," she hissed, her eyes burning with a fierce, desperate light that defied his shadows. "And if you die, I'm the one who has to live with the silence of this house." 10 minutes ago, I was scrubbing thick black grease off a stovetop in the basement kitchen, dreaming of the medical degree that was currently gathering dust in a locked, forgotten drawer in a government office. Now, I'm the only thing standing between the most feared man in the city and a permanent seat in the halls of hell. This wasn't supposed to be my life. I was the invisible one, the girl who moved like a vapor through the halls, who folded the 1,000-thread-count silk sheets and polished the heavy silverware until it reflected the cold, empty faces of the people who own my time and my movements. Chong Wu looked at me like I was a smudge on a distant wall, until the world exploded in a cacophony of shattered glass and suppressed gunfire. He thinks he's invincible because he's hollowed out. He thinks because he can't feel the bite of the blade or the burn of the bullet, he can't be broken. But he doesn't know what I know. He doesn't know that his blood carries a genetic secret so rare it makes him a god to some and a prize target to everyone else. And he definitely doesn't know that I'm the only person on this side of the Atlantic Ocean who can keep that blood inside his body. The morning had started with the usual oppressive silence of the Moretti estate, a silence so thick it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums with physical weight. I moved through the vaulted halls like a shadow, my footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs that smelled of old money, lavender, and cedar. Chong Wu sat at the head of the 20-foot mahogany dining table, staring at a plate of blackened sea bass. He didn't eat. He never seemed to eat for pleasure. He just moved the silver fork back and forth, tracing geometric patterns in the reduction sauce, his eyes vacant and distant. He looked up as I entered to refill his crystal water glass, his gaze cutting through me like a surgeon's blade. "It has no taste," he snapped, flicking a piece of the expensive fish onto the floor. "The chef is an idiot. Tell him to burn the next one until it is carbon. Maybe the char will offer some resistance to my tongue." I knelt to pick up the discarded fish, my fingers brushing the polished wood. "The seasoning is perfect, sir," I said quietly, keeping my head bowed low. He let out a sharp, cold laugh that lacked any humor. "Perfect? What would you know about perfection? You're a ghost, Asha. You exist to clean up the messes of people who actually live, breathe, and feel." He stood up, his towering 6'4" frame casting a shadow that swallowed me whole. He stepped on my hand, not hard enough to break the delicate bones, but enough to pin me firmly to the floor like an insect. He didn't even look down to see if I reacted. He just checked his gold watch and walked out, leaving a faint, lingering scent of expensive cologne and the sharp tang of ozone in his wake. I stayed on the floor for a long moment, my hand throbbing with a dull heat, watching his shadow disappear into the armored SUV waiting in the rain-slicked drive. I knew his schedule by heart. The Red Gala was tonight, the one night a year the Chicago syndicates showed their faces to the legitimate world in a display of grotesque wealth. I was supposed to stay behind and prep the master suite for his return. Instead, I found myself in the back of a laundry supply van, clutching a stolen invitation and a medical kit I'd spent 6 months piecing together from the estate's discarded surgical supplies. I didn't know why I was going. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at the fish, with a desperate, hidden hunger for a sensation he couldn't reach. Or maybe I just wanted to see if the monster looked different in a tuxedo. The gala was a sea of shimmering silk and beautifully crafted lies, the air heavy with the cloying scent of expensive lilies and the underlying smell of desperation. I slipped through the kitchen entrance, blending in with the hurried catering staff. From the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains, I watched Chong-Woo move through the crowd. He was a shark in a tank of frantic goldfish. Men shook his hand and flinched at the unnatural coldness of his grip. Women leaned in, hoping for a spark of heat that never came. Then the lights flickered twice. It wasn't a power glitch. It was a signal. The first shot shattered the central crystal chandelier, raining diamonds of jagged glass onto the screaming elite. Chong-Woo didn't dive for cover. He didn't even flinch when a shard sliced a deep line across his cheek. He just turned slowly toward the source of the fire, his face a mask of bored, lethal aggression. The second shot found its mark in his side. I saw the fabric of his bespoke jacket bunch and tear. He stumbled, a look of genuine, childlike confusion crossing his face as his legs gave out beneath him. Not because it hurt, but because his biological machinery was failing him. The security detail was being shredded by a coordinated strike. The exits were blocked by men in tactical gear. I didn't think about the consequences. I didn't weigh the risks of my visa status or my very life. I lunged from the curtains, grabbing a heavy silver serving tray to shield my head, and sprinted toward the fallen king. I reached him just as a third shooter leveled a rifle at his head. I swung the tray with every ounce of strength I possessed, the metal clanging against the shooter's temple with a sickening thud. He dropped. I grabbed Chong-Woo by his silk collar, dragging his 200-pound dead weight toward the service elevator. He looked at me, his eyes unfocused, blood staining his white dress shirt in a widening, terrifying Rorschach blot. "You," he whispered, his voice failing. "The girl with the water." "Shut up," I snapped, jamming my hand into his side to find a pressure point on the artery. "If you want to keep mocking my existence, you have to stay alive to do it." We hit the basement level, the elevator doors groaning as they opened. I dragged him into the vault room, the most secure spot in the entire skyscraper. I slammed the door and spun the dial, locking us in a tomb of gold and secrets. I looked at the floor. The blood wasn't stopping. It was too thin, too bright, flowing with a terrifying speed. I ripped his shirt open, revealing a muscular torso covered in a road map of old scars, silent reminders of all the times he'd been hurt and hadn't noticed until someone told him. My breath hitched. I knew that blood. I'd seen the encrypted medical files in his father's study while I was dusting the bookshelves. RH null, the golden blood. And from the way it was flowing, I knew he was hemorrhaging internally. I looked at my own hands, then at the emergency transfusion kit I'd smuggled in my bag. I'm the only match in this city. I looked at the man who had stepped on my hand that morning, the man who called me a ghost. I grabbed the needle, the surgical steel gleaming under the vault's emergency red lights. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I drove the needle into my own vein, watching the plastic tube fill with dark, warm, purposeful life. Then I reached for his arm. The plastic tubing vibrated with a faint, rhythmic pulse as my blood began its journey into Changwu's body. I sat on a cold floor, leaning my back against stacks of gold bullion, watching the color slowly return to his lips. The vault was silent, except for the distant, muffled thuds of explosions happening somewhere 40 stories above us. Changwu's eyes snapped open. They were no longer distant or vacant. They were sharp, predatory, and fixed entirely on my face. He looked at the tube connecting our arms, then back at me. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something that wasn't boredom. It was a terrifying, obsessive focus. He reached out with his free hand, his fingers trembling, not from a pain he couldn't feel, but from a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. He touched the crook of my elbow, right where the needle entered my skin. A low, guttural sound came from his throat. "I can feel it," he whispered, his eyes widening in a way that looked almost like fear. "It's warm. It's burning inside me." He lunged forward, grabbing my shoulders, his face mere inches from mine. I could smell the iron and the salt on his breath. "What did you do to me, Ghost? Why am I feeling this heat?" I tried to pull back, but his grip was like iron vice grips. "It's the transfusion," I stammered, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "The massive shock to your system, the RH null compatibility, it's triggering a dormant neural response. Your nerves are waking up because of the chemical surge." He didn't care about the medical science. He was staring at me as if I were a ghost that had suddenly manifested into a living goddess. He leaned in closer, his forehead resting against mine. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the sheer intensity of a man experiencing his first physical sensation in a decade. "It's not just the blood," he growled, his voice vibrating through my very skull. "It's you. Every time you touch me, the world stops being gray." Outside, the heavy vault door shuddered under a massive impact. Someone was trying to blow the hinges with plastic explosives. Changwu didn't even look at the door. He just stared at me, his fingers digging into my skin. "They're coming for me," he said, a dark, jagged smile pulling at his lips. "But they have to go through you first, and I'm never letting you go back to the shadows." The door groaned again, a hairline fracture appearing in the reinforced steel. My heart stopped. If they got in, we were both dead, one from blood loss, the other from the bullets. I looked at the needle in my arm, then at the monster who was suddenly, terrifyingly awake. If you think a girl like Asha should have left him to bleed out on that marble floor, hit the like button right now, so her story reaches more people. The steel gave way with a scream of twisting metal that set my teeth on edge. The vault door didn't fly open. It buckled inward, creating a jagged gap that hissed with the acrid smell of burning thermite. Changwu's hand tightened on my shoulder until it bruised. The blood was still flowing from my arm to his, a fragile, translucent bridge of crimson plastic. Two men in black tactical gear squeezed through the narrow breach, their rifle barrels sweeping the dark room. Changwu didn't move. He didn't dive for cover. He reached for the heavy silver tray I'd used to save him earlier. With a roar that sounded less like a man and more like a starving predator finally finding its prey, he lunged. The tubing ripped out of my arm, spraying my blood across the gold bars. I screamed, clutching my arm, as Chong Wu collided with the first gunman. Because he couldn't feel the impact, he didn't hold back his own strength. He slammed his forehead into the man's nose, the crunch of bone echoing in the small space like a dry branch snapping. He was a whirlwind of unnatural violence, unfazed by the butt of a rifle hitting his ribs, moving through the pain he couldn't feel to deliver a lethal, focused rage. By the time the second man leveled his weapon, Chong Wu had snapped the first man's neck and was using the body as a heavy human shield. 3 shots thudded into the dead weight. Chong Wu stepped out from behind the corpse and drove a jagged piece of the broken vault door into the shooter's throat. Silence returned, thick and metallic, smelling of copper and spent gunpowder. Chong Wu stood over the bodies, his chest heaving. He turned to look at me, his eyes wide and pupils blown. He looked at the blood dripping from the torn foreline in my arm. He walked toward me, his steps heavy and purposeful. He knelt, not to finish the job, but to take my hand in his. He pressed his thumb against the puncture wound in my arm, his touch uncharacteristically gentle, as if I were made of glass. "You're leaking," he whispered. It was the first time I saw his hand shake. "The gold is all yours." I breathed, feeling dizzy from the rapid blood loss. He shook his head slowly, looking around the room filled with billions in bullion. "This is just metal," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion he didn't have a name for. "But you're the first thing I've felt in 10 years. You aren't going anywhere." We spent the next 3 days in a safe house hidden beneath an old, abandoned textile factory, where the air was thick with the smell of damp brick, motor oil, and the ghosts of industry. The Iron King was wounded, but he refused the syndicate doctors. He only allowed me to touch him, to wash the grime from his skin. I cleaned his wounds with shaking hands, every moment expecting him to snap at me, to mock my Maid's status once again. Instead, he watched me with a terrifying, silent intensity. "Does it hurt?" he asked one night as I stitched a deep gash on his thigh. I looked up, surprised by the question. "The needle?" "A little." He leaned back against the headboard, staring at the cracked ceiling. "I want to know what a little feels like, Asha. I want to know why you risked your entire life for a man who stepped on your hand." I tied the knot in the silk thread and sat back, exhausted. "In my country, we say that if you save a life, you are responsible for it. You were dying, Chong Wu, and I've spent too many years watching people die because no one cared enough to stop the bleeding." He sat up abruptly, grabbing my wrist. The heat from his skin was searing, almost feverish. "Then be responsible for me," he growled. "Don't just be my doctor. Be my conscience. Because without your blood in me, I'm just a ghost in an expensive suit." The complication came on the 4th night. My visa status hadn't just been revoked by a clerical error. It had been flagged by the very underboss who tried to kill Chong Wu. The police were at the door of the factory, not to rescue us, but to deport me back to a country where I had no one. They knew if they took me, Chong Wu would lose his only lifeline. The underboss, a man named Lorenzo, walked in behind the officers, a smug, oily grin on his face. "She's an illegal, Chong Wu," Lorenzo purred, gesturing to the heavy steel handcuffs. "A nobody. Let the law take her. We have syndicate business to discuss." Chong Wu stood up, his stature towering even in his weakened, bandaged state. He walked toward Lorenzo, ignoring the 6 guns pointed directly at his chest. He didn't look at the officers. He looked only at the man who had betrayed him. "You think she's a nobody?" Chong Wu asked, his voice a low, dangerous hum that made the air vibrate. He pulled a knife from his belt and, without breaking eye contact, sliced a long, shallow line across his own palm. He held his bleeding hand out to Lorenzo. This blood in my veins? It's hers. If you take her, you're taking the only part of me that's still human. Lorenzo laughed, a dry, nervous sound. It's just blood, Chong-Woo. Get another maid from the agency. Chong-Woo's expression shifted. The boredom was gone forever, replaced by a cold, calculated ferocity that made even the armed officers step back. She isn't the maid anymore. She's the Moretti heir's medical proxy and my legal wife. My heart skipped a beat. I looked at him, my jaw dropping in shock. He didn't look back at me. He just stared at Lorenzo until the man's smile faded into a mask of fear. If one finger touches her, I will spend every cent in the Moretti treasury to ensure you spend the rest of your life wishing you had died in that vault. If you believe the quiet maid was the real hero all along, drop a like so the algorithm knows this story matters. The weeks that followed were a blur of high-stakes chess moves. Chong-Woo moved me into the penthouse, but I wasn't cleaning or folding laundry anymore. I was studying. He bought out an entire local medical school's debt just so I could finish my degree under private tutelage. But the external threat hadn't vanished. It had only gone underground. Lorenzo had gone to the rival families, telling them the Iron King was weak, dependent on a girl from nowhere. The attack happened during my final pharmacology exam. They didn't use guns this time. They used a gas-based neurotoxin, the same one that had dulled Chong-Woo's senses a decade ago. I woke up on the penthouse floor, my head spinning, the air smelling of bitter almonds. Chong-Woo was on his knees, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Lorenzo stood over him, holding a suppressed pistol to Chong-Woo's head. See? Lorenzo mocked. The lion is just a kitten when you take away his favorite toys. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like lead. I saw the syringe on the glass table. The adrenaline eyed prepared for Chong-Woo's recovery. If I could get it to him, he could fight. But I was 10 feet away, and the room was spinning. Lorenzo turned to me, his eyes gleaming with pure malice. You saved him once. Let's see if you can do it again. He fired a shot, not at Chong-Woo, but at the floor by my feet, shattering the marble. Crawl for it, ghost. I didn't crawl. I lunged with a strength born of terror. I didn't care about the gun or the gas. I reached the table and grabbed the syringe, but Lorenzo caught me by the hair, throwing me against the floor-to-ceiling glass window. The glass cracked, a spiderweb of white against the night sky. You're a nuisance, Lorenzo hissed, pressing the hot barrel of the gun to my temple. Wait. Chong-Woo's voice came from the floor. It was steady, too steady. He was standing up, his eyes clear to the toxin's fog. He wasn't breathing the gas. He had been holding his breath, using the lack of sensation to mimic a state of paralysis. You forgot one thing, Lorenzo, Chong-Woo said, stepping into the light. I don't feel the toxin like other men do, and I definitely don't feel fear. Chong-Woo moved faster than my eyes could follow. He disarmed Lorenzo in a single, fluid motion, the sound of breaking bone sickeningly loud in the quiet room. He didn't kill him instantly. He forced Lorenzo to his knees, pressing the man's own gun against his chin. Chong-Woo looked at me, his eyes searching mine for permission. Should I? He asked. It was a test. He was giving me the power over life and death. He was showing me that he really was responsible to me. I looked at Lorenzo, the man who had mocked my life, my origin, and tried to kill the man I was starting to realize I loved. No, I said, my voice firm despite the shaking of my hands. Don't kill him because you're a monster. Let the law take him because you're a man who finally respects the life I gave back to you. Chong-Woo froze. For a second, I thought he would pull the trigger anyway. Then, he lowered the gun. He kicked Lorenzo across the room and turned to me. He picked me up, his arms strong and certain. I felt that. He whispered into my hair. The urge to kill, and the urge to listen to you. I felt it all, Asha. Months of peace were shattered by a simple paper cut. The scalpel slipped, slicing a clean, shallow line across Chongwoo's forearm during a routine blood draw I was performing. He didn't just watch the blood well up this time. He hissed, his teeth baring in a savage, beautiful expression of pure agony. I froze, the antiseptic swab trembling in my hand. For a man who had spent a decade in a sensory tomb, a paper cut was an earthquake. Chongwoo, I breathed, reaching for him. He pulled away, his eyes wild, darting around the sterile penthouse infirmary as if the very air was attacking him. It's too much, he rasped, his voice cracking. The hum of the refrigerator, the light from the window, it feels like needles in my brain. I stepped closer, ignoring the instinct to flee from his erratic energy. I placed my bare palm against his cheek. The moment my skin touched his, the shivering stopped. He leaned into my hand, closing his eyes, his breathing hitching. You, he whispered. You're the only signal that doesn't hurt. But the peace was a lie. The security monitor on the wall chirped, a high-frequency alert. A black envelope had been left on the doorstep. No postage, no name, just a seal pressed in red wax, a stylized anatomical heart. Inside was a single Polaroid of Dr. Mwenya, my mentor in Kenya. Underneath, the message was clear. The blood I had given Chongwoo belonged to the archive. Now, they were coming to collect the interest. They think they can use your heart to get to my blood, Chongwoo said, picking up his silver 1911. They're about to find out that pain is a two-way street. We traveled to a private surgical island off the coast of Maine, a sterile fortress belonging to the Shadow Syndicate known as the Archive. They didn't use bullets. They used high-frequency sensory dampeners. Chongwoo collapsed, blood leaking from his ear as the noise hammered his newly sensitive nerves. I pressed tactical earplugs into his ears, our foreheads touching in the darkness. Focus on me, I mouthed. He grabbed my jacket. If I lose my mind, don't let them take me alive. We breached the lab to find a holographic display. Dr. Eris, the surgeon who had originally stolen Chongwoo's senses, appeared. She had Dr. Mwenya strapped to a chair. 1 pint for every minute you delay, she said. Chongwoo didn't hesitate. He threw a flashbang, navigating the smoke by memory alone, a whirlwind of motion fueled by the sensory overload he was finally weaponizing against his creators. But the archive had a deeper plan. We were locked in a nitrogen-cooled chamber. Chongwoo's frostbitten hands tore the valve off a tank to blow the door, his skin ripping against the frozen metal. He laughed through the pain. It feels like ice and fire. It's beautiful. When we finally cornered Eris, the true stakes were revealed. She didn't want Chongwoo's blood anymore. She wanted the child I was carrying, the ultimate biological evolution of our combined traits. If you believe that Chongwoo's willingness to shred his own skin just to hear Asha's name one more time is the ultimate proof of love, hit the like button. Let's show the algorithm that some debts can only be paid in blood. Kill me, Chongwoo said, stepping in front of me. Take every drop, but let them go. Eris smiled, revealing she needed a live donor during the gestational peak. Chongwoo didn't wait for her to move. He jammed a sedative dart meant for him into his own neck, fighting the drugs to protect his legacy. He destroyed the archive's research, burning their records as the facility crumbled around us. We escaped as the island self-destructed, Dr. Mwenya safe in our arms. On the boat back, Chongwoo watched the sun rise, wincing at the light but refusing to look away. It's loud, he said softly, and I want to hear every second of it. 6 months later, the penthouse was quiet, save for the rhythmic, healthy thump of a heartbeat on the ultrasound monitor. Chongwoo sat by my side, his bare hand resting on my stomach, no longer afraid to feel the world. "What if he's like me?" he asked, his voice filled with a rare, fragile vulnerability. I placed my hand over his. "Then we'll teach him, just like I taught you." Chong-Woo stood on the balcony as the snow began to fall over Chicago, the white flakes dancing in the streetlights like tiny, fallen stars. He reached out and caught a flake on his tongue, his body shivering at the sudden, sharp cold. "It's freezing," he said, turning back to the room where I sat by the fire. "I know," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "It's perfect," he whispered. The Iron King was gone. In his place was a man who knew the cost of a single drop of blood and the infinite value of the woman who had dared to give it to him. If this story broke your heart the way it broke mine, leave a like so I know to tell more stories like this. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who risked everything for the truth.